very welcome. In the second session of my reflections on the scriptures of the Easter Vigil, I'm focusing in on Exodus chapter 14, verses 15 until chapter 15 and verse 1. This is the third of the Old Testament readings, and it's very clearly stated that if you are going to shorten the number of readings and take it down from 7, the one reading that must always stay is Exodus chapter 14. This chapter gives us part of the Exodus story. Now, the Exodus is unbelievably important in the Hebrew Bible. It is the foundational event for Israel's self-understanding. It's a story of their birth as a people. And like all foundational stories, it's not simply there to recount some history. What it is there for is to give answers to the questions: what is God like? Who are the people of God? In other words, it's about the core identity of Israel as the people of God. And you'll find that when you are reading the Hebrew scriptures, it's kind of like everything is either building up to or it's flowing out from this moment, this Exodus event. And the Exodus is a paradigm as well for understanding the exile and return. You may remember in my first session when I spoke about, it was particularly the Isaiah 54 and Isaiah 55, actually also Baruch and Ezekiel. All of those texts come from the time of exile, a time when later in their history the people of God are once again looking with longing for God to come and save them, are looking to continue the journey with God. And one of the things that the prophets do quite often is draw on Exodus imagery. So if you want to get to the heart of the Old Testament, the window or the door in is through the Exodus. The Exodus basically plays the same role in the Hebrew Bible that the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus plays in the New Testament and in the Christian faith. So the Exodus, a really important story, and a story that tells us something very fundamental, something very foundational about God and about the people of God. Just before I leave the slide, just to point out the picture that I've used. I don't know if you notice here, we have the people coming through the sea, but the people who are coming through the sea are not dressed as ancient Israelites. This is a story that is told and retold as our story. And so here you have a picture of modern Jewish people. I don't know if you can notice some of them are carrying the scrolls, and you've got the tambourines. We'll actually look at the tambourines later. They're all celebrating the fact that God is bringing them out of slavery into freedom. And we saw in session 1 in the Easter proclamation that it uses the words, "This is the night, this is the night." The same is said at the Passover when the Exodus story is being celebrated. It's not celebrated as ancient history, it's celebrated as this is the night, as this is the story of how God has been with us as God's people. It's not told about them, it's told about us, a foundational story. Here are 2 verses out of many, many that I could have chosen in the Hebrew Bible that show just how fundamental and central the Exodus is. So when the people under Joshua are going to renew the covenant, this is what they say. "It's the Lord our God who brought us and our ancestors up from the land of Egypt out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight. He protected us along the way that we went and among all the peoples through whom we passed. Therefore, we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God." So this is our God, the God of the Exodus, the God who rescues us, and therefore the people commit to serving God. And then the second one on this slide, I don't know if you can see the full reference there properly. It's Exodus 20 verses 2 and 3. This is the beginning of the 10 Commandments. And if you learnt them in school, you probably jumped straight from I am the Lord your God to you shall have no other gods. Actually, the way it's given to us in sacred scripture has these words: I am the Lord your God, and then the identity of this God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then we go on to the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me, etc., etc. So the God of the Exodus and the people of God, they are mutually kind of identifying, and the God of the Exodus shapes the people, and the people are shaped by the God of the Exodus. The story of the God of the Exodus is really a story that very strongly shapes our understanding of God in relationship to power. It's a story of God versus the empire. So Pharaoh is very much portrayed as the oppressor. He is the one who traps, who oppresses, who enslaves, and who works practically to death the people of God. He is the oppressor. This is really important for us to see these power dynamics, because if we think of this simply as God of Israel versus Pharaoh and Egypt, we could think of it in terms of kind of petty warfare between nations, or maybe even have the sense that for some reason God doesn't like the Egyptians. That's not at all how the story is told. The story is very much a story of God versus empire. And what is it about Pharaoh that has God so opposed to Pharaoh and has God bringing down Pharaoh and the power of Pharaoh's armies? Pharaoh, as the oppressor, stands for the powerful empire which dehumanizes, and God intervenes to set the people free. Now, Hebrew is the language that the people speak, so they're sometimes called Hebrews as well as Israelites. But it seems from ancient texts, particularly ones that we found that were written from ancient Canaan to the Pharaoh in Egypt and were actually stored in Egypt, we discovered that the little petty city-states in Canaan, for example, I guess you could call those the little mini pharaohs, had a real problem with people that they called the Habiru or Hapiru. And these people were not so much an ethnic group as a social class. They were landless people who lived outside the established social order. Now, they probably got that way in a number of, in taking a number of different paths. Perhaps they had lost land as the little city-states with their kings took control over more and more agricultural land. Perhaps they were refugees from war. Perhaps they were migrants traveling to find a better life. But what we know about them is that they were landless and they lived outside the social order. And they are seen by the settled people as trespassers, as a danger, and as a threat. So we can certainly say that the ancient Israelites in Egypt and also in the beginning in the land of Palestine or Canaan, that they were Hebrews or Apiru. They certainly belonged to this class, but not all Apiru were Israelites. In other words, there were other groups of people in a similar situation referred to by those in power or the settled people as Apiru or Abiru. So the story of the Exodus is going to be the story of God versus empire. The story of the Exodus as a whole is the story of salvation or the story of redemption. It's the journey from oppression to freedom. quite literally, the word Exodus means going out. We refer to it as a redemption story because it is God setting free slaves, and redemption is the buying back or the setting free of slaves. We find it in the first half of the book of Exodus, in Exodus chapters 1 to 15. It begins by referring to the way the Israelites migrated to Egypt and how they ended up being enslaved there. They were to build the storehouses for the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh feels very threatened by them and so oppresses them. The story of the Exodus then gives us the story of Moses, God raising up a deliverer. You probably know the story of the burning bush. When God sets out to actually rescue God's people, it is done in two stages, or there are two aspects to the Exodus. The first part is the story of the plagues, and the second part is the crossing of the sea. That's where Exodus 14 that we're going to read comes in. So the 10 plagues, these are told as the might, the strong arm and the mighty hand of the Lord against Pharaoh and against Pharaoh's gods. So, for example, when God brings darkness over the land, God is showing that God is more powerful than the sun god Re, one of the greatest gods in Egypt. And what the plagues do is they show in very dramatic fashion that the God of the Hebrews, even if God is the God of the weak and the marginalized and the overlooked, well, that God actually is more powerful than the oppressive empire. At the end of the story of the plagues, the people are allowed to go free, and so they set out in a hurry. That's where the story of the Passover comes in. The Passover celebrates or commemorates the hurried departure from Egypt and the fact that the people of God had been kept safe. Once they hurry away from Egypt, we have the second half of the deliverance event, which is the crossing of the sea. What happens is the people of God flee. They get as far as the sea. The Pharaoh changes his mind, sends the army after him, and the story of the crossing of the sea is a story of God making a way when everything looks impossible. And the way God rescues at the sea is in two ways. First of all, by opening up a way for the people of God, for the Israelites, and then secondly, by drowning the Egyptian army. So God destroys the powerful oppressor at the sea. Those are the two pieces of the Exodus story. And it's the crossing of the sea, Exodus 14, that is our focus. I know the writing is quite small on this slide, but I wanted to get the whole reading in so that you could just glance at it to see some of the repetitions. This is a text that's made for proclaiming, made to be heard. It's very, very effective on the ear, in large part because of the many repetitions that it uses. So there's definitely more repetitions than I've marked, but I've used color to draw out some of them. So you'll hear the repetition 4 times of stretch out your hand over the sea. There's repetition of on dry land or dry ground. It's the same in the Hebrew. There is also repetition of the Pharaoh, his army, his chariots, his horsemen 5 times, really emphasizing the power and the danger of this great army. The last repetition doesn't actually come across as strongly in this English translation as it does in the Hebrew. I've marked that in green, and the Hebrew is betoch hayam, in the midst of the sea. And sometimes here it's right into the sea, sometimes it's through the sea. But in the Hebrew you have this repetition of betoch hayam, in the midst of the sea, in the midst of the sea. So I will read it. The Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me so? Tell the sons of Israel to march on. For yourself, raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and part it for the sons of Israel to walk through the sea on dry ground." Literally, to walk in the midst of the sea on dry ground. "I, for my part, will make the heart of the Egyptians so stubborn that they will follow them. So shall I win for myself glory at the expense of Pharaoh, of all his army, his chariots, and his horsemen. And when I have won glory for myself at the expense of Pharaoh and his chariots and his army, the Egyptians will learn that I am the Lord." Then the angel of the Lord, who marched at the front of the army of Israel, changed station and moved to their rear. The pillar of cloud changed station from the front to the rear of them and remained there. It came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. The cloud was dark, and the night passed without the armies drawing any closer the whole night long. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove back the sea with a strong easterly wind all night, and he made dry land of the sea. The waters parted, and the sons of Israel went on dry ground in the midst of the sea, walls of water to right and to left of them. The Egyptians gave chase. After them they went into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. In the morning watch the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians from the pillar of fire and of cloud, and threw the army into confusion. He so clogged their chariot wheels that they could scarcely make headway. "Let us flee from the Israelites," the Egyptians cried. "The Lord is fighting for them against the Egyptians." "Stretch out your hand over the sea," the Lord said to Moses, "that the waters may flow back on the Egyptians and their chariots and their horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and as day broke, the sea returned to its bed. The fleeing Egyptians marched right into it, and the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. The returning waters overwhelmed the chariots and the horsemen of Pharaoh's whole army, which had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not a single one of them was left. But the sons of Israel had marched in the midst of the sea on dry ground, walls of water to right and left of them. That day the Lord rescued Israel from the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. Israel witnessed the great act that the Lord had performed against the Egyptians, and the people venerated the Lord. They put their faith in the Lord and in Moses his servant. It was then that Moses and the sons of Israel sang this song in honor of the Lord. And very effectively at the Easter Vigil, the reading stops there, and immediately the singers pick up as a responsorial psalm the next piece of the text, which is Exodus 15, which is the story of the Song of the Sea. One more thing I want to point out. Did you see or hear, should I say, all the mention of the armies? And sometimes we heard of the army of the Egyptians and the army of Israel, or the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. You really need to hear, in a certain sense, the irony there. These are not two armies lined up against each other. This is the army of perhaps at this stage the most powerful empire in the world, and a crowd of raggle-taggle fleeing slaves. So even though this presents it as one army against the other, it's certainly not an equal contest at all. It's often interesting to notice where a passage begins and where it ends. So this reading, which kind of actually does start sort of halfway in the story, probably if you want the whole story, you need to read the whole of chapter 14. But the point at which it starts has God saying that when I've won glory for myself, the Egyptians will learn that I am the Lord. So this mighty act of the Lord, this mighty act of salvation, is a way of God showing God's glory. But even though at the beginning it says the Egyptians will learn this, at the end of the reading we have that Israel, having witnessed the great acts that the Lord had performed against the Egyptians, that they are the ones who put their faith in the Lord and in Moses, his servant. So this is the effect of God's saving work, that Israel is able to put their faith in God, to learn that God truly is the Lord. And it's interesting that it's in the Lord and in Moses, his servant. For me, it's really a pity that this reading starts in verse 15 and omits the previous verse, because this is not a story of a battle between two great armies and the stronger one wins. Yes, in many ways it's quite a violent story, but the violence is not done by the Israelites. What we're actually told is that when they start crying out to God in fear and in terror and complaining to Moses, that Moses says to them, after God has reassured him, that the Lord will do the fighting for you, you only have to keep still. So this story of salvation is a story of God acting on behalf of God's people, and the people only have to trust, and then when they're told to walk, to walk. As I said earlier, that the salvation here is God doing two things. God is making a way for the Israelites, and God is destroying the pursuing army. Did you hear how in the dividing of the sea, God and Moses are at work? It's not surprising that the people put their trust in God and in Moses. So Moses is the one who was told to stretch out his staff, to hold his staff in his hand and stretch it out over the sea. But then we're told that all night long a wind from God blew. So you have Moses' symbolic act of trust, and you have God at work. The way the Egyptian army is defeated, did you see God enticing them in? And in fact, if we'd read the whole of chapter 14, we would see that God, in the first place, enticed the Egyptians to follow the people by having them wandering for a while, and thought the Egyptians would say, oh, let's go in, because obviously they don't know what they're doing. So God is the one who entices the hard-hearted Egyptians. It's really significant, I think, that their powerful chariots become a hindrance. So the reason they are unstoppable is because of their horses and their chariots, but it's those chariot wheels that get stuck. And then when Moses stretched out his staff twice, the first time was so that the water would divide, and the second time so that the water comes back. So those are the elements of the acts which bring about salvation. You will have heard reference there to the fiery, cloudy pillar. When they left Egypt in the previous chapter, we're told that the Lord went before them by day in the form of a pillar of cloud to show them the way, and by night in the form of a pillar of fire to give them light. Thus they could continue their march by day and by night. This fiery, cloudy pillar, I remember as a child, I used to imagine it as kind of two pillars, and the one got switched off and then the other one got switched on at night. More likely, what we have here is a column of fire representing the presence of God, and that fire is surrounded by smoke and cloud. So in the daytime, the smoke and the cloud is visible, but at nighttime, the light of the fire shines through. So the fiery, cloudy pillar. It's going to play a really important role in the journey of the people of God. It's going to be a visible symbol of God journeying with God's people and guiding them. And what happens is when the pillar comes to a rest, the people know to stop, and when it begins to move, the people know to go. So it's a symbol of God's presence, a symbol of God's presence as a pilgrim God journeying with God's people. Did you hear how there were kind of a blurring of lines between the angel of the Lord and the Lord? And so you had the angel that had been going ahead of them, then moved to go between the Israelites and the Egyptians, and then we're told that the fiery cloudy pillar went there. Now, the way the Jerusalem Bible translates it, it basically just casts darkness. But the Hebrew could mean that you've got darkness on the one side, but you've got the light of the fire on the other side, so that the Egyptians are in darkness, but the people of God are in the light. And it was the angel of the Lord who went back, and then the fiery cloudy pillar went back. But then a little later, we're told that the Lord God looked down from the top of the fiery cloudy pillar to start throwing the Egyptians into confusion. So the fiery cloudy pillar is closely linked to the angel of the Lord, but it also is very much the presence of the Lord God, God's self. I don't know if you also picked up some creation resonances there. The fact that all night you've got a wind, and the word for wind and the word for spirit is the same word. You've got this wind blowing all night over the waters in the darkness, and the waters are divided, and there's a lot of dividing happening in Genesis 1, light from dark, waters above from waters below. And then what happens, as happened in day 3 of the creation story in Genesis 1, dry land appears in the midst of the water. So this story of the birth of the people as the people of God is told in ways that echo the creation story, particularly Genesis chapter 1. And did you pick up the temporal references? In other words, when this story happens. It happens at night, and we're told that it was in the morning watch. So it's at night time that the people go through, and then at the morning watch, which is from about 2 a.m. onwards. In other words, it's the watch waiting for the morning. That at that point, the Lord throws the Egyptian army into confusion, and it's as day breaks, it's at dawn, that the waters return to the seabed, and then that day that the people of God see the destroyed enemy. So what's happening here is that this crossing of the sea is happening at night in the darkness. It's as we move toward the dawn that the army of the Egyptians is, first of all, gets into trouble, and then as day is breaking, the waters are returning, and at that point, the people have been set free. At that point, the enemy, the oppressive army, is drowned, the people are safe on the other side. So here we have a journeying through the night to the morning, which is also a journeying through the sea and a journeying into freedom. Now, if that makes you think at all of the Easter Vigil, which is when this reading is read, where we have this nighttime journey, and remember how important baptism is at the vigil, and even if there isn't any baptisms to be performed, there is still the blessing of the baptismal waters. So you have this nighttime journey through water into freedom. St. Paul was probably reflecting a Jewish interpretation of the story of the crossing of the sea as the story of the birth of the people of God, when he wrote to the Corinthians that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. So you have this being formed as a people through the water under the cloud, this fiery, cloudy pillar, the presence of God, which led them. Really interesting resonances there. I began by saying that the Exodus is a foundational story, and it's a story which reveals the identity of God, the God of the Exodus, and of the people of God. So, who is the God that we meet in this story of the Exodus? God is the God who hears the oppressed slaves and intervenes to bring them to freedom. God heard the people already while they were enslaved in Egypt. And again, in the verses just before where we began to read, God hears when the people cry out to God and they cry out to Moses, terrified at this approaching army. God is the God of freedom against the power of the empire. This is a God who takes sides. This is a God who works to set free. And it's from the story of the Exodus that Redeemer becomes a common attribute of or name for God. God, our Redeemer. Redeeming being setting free slaves. If that's who God is, then who are the people of God? The people of God are the Hebrews, the marginalized ones who have been set free. But what was also important in this story was the way that freedom is accomplished. The people were told to be still and to see what God would do, that God would fight for them. So even though terminology is used of one army against the other, one camp against the other, the movement in the story and the action in the story is very, very clear that what the people of God do is simply trust, and then when the way opens, they walk. So the people of God are those who worship a God who was on the side of the marginalized and who opposes the powerful oppressor. The God of the Exodus is very much a God who takes sides, but the sides being taken are not anti-Egyptian, it's anti the powerful oppressor. Just a couple of words about the response to this reading at the Easter Vigil. The response to this reading is the continuation of the biblical text, and there are excerpts taken from Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea. This is one of the oldest parts in the Hebrew Bible, certainly in the shorter version, which is given toward the end of Exodus 15. Let us sing unto the Lord, he has triumphed gloriously, horse and rider thrown into the sea. This is Miriam's song. It's a response of thanksgiving. Always in Scripture, the appropriate response to God's saving work is to respond in gratitude, to respond in joy, to give thanks, and to give praise. This hymn, this Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea, is a hymn and not a ballad. What I mean by that is if you don't know the story and you just read the hymn, you wouldn't really be able to work out exactly what was happening. It's a hymn because it's celebrating events which are so well known to the people of God. So, Exodus 14, the story of God making a way in the sea and God destroying the oppressive Egyptian army. One thing you might want to reflect on is how comfortable are you with a God who takes sides? How comfortable are you with a God who makes a way for the people and who destroys the oppressor? What I'd suggest is that you might, when you're thinking about that, don't just go into your head and wonder about it, but actually turn it into a conversation with God. Remembering that Mary of the Magnificat also celebrates the one who brings the mighty down from their thrones and who lifts up the humble. And then a second question for reflection. Where has God made a way where there seemed to be no way? Whether it's for yourself, for your family, or for your community. Where have you lived and experienced the story of Exodus 14?